So the hope is that after you prune yourself, the extractor will pull you into the present.
Of course.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and Loki was this big, sprawling, confusing series that introduced all these weird concepts about time travel, retrocausality, free will, determinism. It was a lot to unpack. So there are a lot of plot holes and unanswered questions that all of you asked on our community page and on my Twitter. So I'm going to do my best to answer these questions for you right now.
This coffee's good, huh?
Now first, I want to dive into the number one question all of you had, time travel. Time travel is always going to be hard to understand because it's actually impossible in the real world. So no wonder so many of us were so confused. And just guys, before we get rolling, I want to thank all of you for watching, clicking our video, and for continuing to support us by shopping our merch store. We are also doing our very first live show next February in Brooklyn, New York, and you can get tickets for that to come meet us in person down in the link below. Blake Schaefer asks, if Loki altered how time works in a time outside of time, the TVA, and then reshaped the sacred timeline, then wouldn't that imply that because there is no longer a sacred timeline, the events in Endgame with the Ancient One of the Hulk have changed and or never occurred? Time travel is weird.
Time travel!
Hey, I'm gonna make some more coffee. Do you want some?
We are right in the middle of a video.
Ah, dude, it's not a big deal. Make a commentator capsule right now. So you're right, time travel is weird, but honestly, it's not that weird within the TVA. Mobius says in the very first episode that...
No, there is no past, TVA. Time doesn't work like
But it
that
does
here.
now because it's happening to me.
It's impossible.
But see, that's kind of a misdirection because time in the TVA actually works the same way it does for us. So while the rest of the multiverse is getting erased, rerouted, and rewritten, the TVA moves more or less basically in a straight line. Did you want one?
Oh, yeah, yes, please. Iced latte?
Sure thing, my guy, coming right up. So what that means is the events of Endgame essentially created the Loki who is in this show when he stole the Tesseract. And because Loki went to the TVA, that history will always remain intact. Put another way, the TVA and Loki are the audience. Now, just as we watch and remember the events of Loki journeying through 12 seasons of his show, Loki also remembers his journey because it's his story. He is the constant that time spins around.
Oh, I get it. Oh, by the way, that coffee smells amazing. How did you make that so fast?
Well, buddy, this is a Cometeer capsule, and thank you, Cometeer, for sponsoring this video. You see, Cometeer coffee is delicious and tastes so fresh. It is brewed from craft coffee beans that come from the very best roasters in the country, never burned or diluted, flash frozen to lock in freshness. So not only does it taste good, but it's also, as you can see, very easy to make. You don't need any kind of special machine. You just take a frozen capsule, pour in hot water, and you're done. And for iced coffee, just drop in the capsule from the fridge, and for a latte, add in whatever milk you like. And all that's great, but I have to emphasize how delicious and fresh this coffee is. They have a huge range of flavors for you to try. This one is called the Original. It's got notes of citrus, honey, and chocolate, and it's way more cost effective than hitting up the drive-thru every morning. So right now, when you join Cometeer, you get a limited edition holiday starter pack and a free travel tumbler when you sign up. That's a free travel tumbler when you click the link in the description or go to cometeer.com/ScreenCrush. Now back to Loki. Awesome Sauce 79, a reference to this.
Hey, I love you.
Dude, shut up! That is awesome sauce!
Has a pretty common question. Maybe I just don't understand how time loops work, but how did Obi still have the knowledge to write the TVA book at the end, but Victor Timely no longer receives the TVA book in the past from Renslayer? Wouldn't that stop him from learning what's needed by Timely to create the TVA? Now that is a great question, and just to back up a little bit on all this. Now we talked about this in our Easter egg videos, but the entire season is an Ouroboros loop.
It's like a snake eating its own tail.
This is when events in the future affect events in the past, like in Futurama when Fry travels back in time to become his own grandfather.
Or like the ending of Terminator.
Exactly. Now, there is also something called a time loop. Now, we've seen this a lot in sci-fi shows like Star Trek Next Generation, but its most famous use is in the movie Groundhog Day. Characters find themselves repeating the same events over and over, except in the MCU, the time loop was the death of He Who Remains and then restarting the multiversal war.
You plunge your blade in my chest, and an infinite amount of me start another multiversal war, and I just end up right back here anyways.
But what you have to understand is the presence of Loki changes all of that. Loki is able to totally rewrite the timeline of the TVA itself. He can change events of the TVA's past, and he can break this cycle.
Yeah, but then why does Loki have that power?
Great question. Loki gets this power because He Who Remains wanted him to have this power. He wasn't lying when Loki first showed up. What he really wanted was for someone to take over for him.
You take over and return to the TVA as its benevolent rulers.
So everything we have seen in the past 2 seasons was a way for Loki to become ready to take over for He Who Remains. He had to mature and learn to become selfless because he alone could become a guardian of the timelines. So to answer your question about the TVA manuals, first off, remember that we're watching a sequence of events that is brand new. In that multiversal time loop I just mentioned, there was never a Loki who could time slip. So even though OB says that he learned everything he knew from a man named Victor Timely, we actually never get to see that original past. Now I have a feeling that whenever He Who Remains originally built the TVA, he pulled his variant Victor Timely out of the branch timeline to teach young OB everything he knew. The point is, the intervention of Loki and bringing Timely to the TVA moments before it was destroyed means that we never saw how Timely and OB originally met, you know, back in the early days of the TVA. And I know what you're thinking. If OB never learned from Timely, then how does he still know everything that he knows? He still retains that knowledge because he exists in a linear cause and effect timeline. A linear cause and effect timeline because he is in the TVA. Again, the TVA represents the audience. Events that happen in the TVA and events that happen to Loki happen in chronological order. So what happened to OB in the past is still happening unless Loki decided to change that past via time slipping.
Oh, okay, so OB learned from a past version of Victor Timely, but there won't be a new version of Victor Timely to teach OB again after the TVA is destroyed and rebuilt.
That's exactly right, Doug. Well done.
Hey, what's this fudging thing doing in here? Oh, hi, Doug.
Doug, this is the new Doug plushie we're making in partnership with Makeship. So this is something we've wanted to do for a really long time, but making plushies is super expensive. So Makeship is holding a fundraiser for us. So if you would like your very own Doug plushie, you can go to our merch store or straight to Makeship and pre-order one. And if enough of us pre-order, then you will get your plushie. And while you're at our merch store, check out our 50% off Cyber Monday sale and our brand new items like this Den and Grogu parody ET shirt, Fraser Beast, and this new Doug ornament where he looks like Hermie the Elf. Shopping our merch store is the best way to support our channel and what we do here.
And also, I am so soft. I hate you.
17 the Goat 87 asks, how can OB remember the memories in the moment Loki is speaking to him in the past? You guys remember that moment, right? When like Loki was affecting the past and then OB suddenly remembered them in the future?
But it must have been something else because I've never seen anything close to that happen before. Wait, a long time ago he came to me complaining about time slipping.
But everyone else doesn't remember Loki from when he time slips past to future and back. If OB remembered Mobius visiting him 400 years ago, why wouldn't he remember Loki? Well look, Mobius does not remember OB because he came down to the basement once when he took a wrong turn. But for OB, Mobius was like his only visitor ever, so of course he remembers him. Now that scene you're talking about when Loki changes OB's past and it affects his future, Bill and Ted style, the answer to that's simple. Loki is able to change OB's memories in real time because he is time slipping within the TVA. Time slipping is a fancy word for time traveling. The kind of time travel where changing the past actually affects the future, which we saw in movies like Hot Tub Time Machine and Back to the Future. Again, think of Loki's perspective as the audience's perspective. As the audience sees OB learn things in the past, and then we cut to present, OB then knows the things that he just learned in the past because we're watching it happen. Dixon Otenio on Twitter asks, if the loom wasn't working because you can't scale for infinity, how is the final tree solution able to work with an infinite number of branches? Does Yggdrasil get taller or wider forever, or does it exist in multiple infinite timelines? Does this mean that time is now linear and no longer in a loop as it was on the sacred timeline? And what does this mean in terms of incursions, especially since they're all held together by Loki? Must Loki sit on the throne for things to work? That is a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to speed run them for you. The loom cannot account for infinity because it's always going to have a finite size, the circle, but the tree can just continue to grow outward at both ends. So yes, infinite roots and branches forever, that's what infinity means. Now as far as time being linear and not in a loop, the only reason the sacred timeline ran in a loop is because He Who Remains had to control it. And part of that control was setting up a scenario where he would always die and always be reborn. So no matter what, he would always end up on top. Now, as for incursions, who really knows? If I were writing these movies, I would make the rule that an incursion is like an unnatural collision of timelines. Like an incursion is rot in the world tree that Loki has created. But we're gonna have to wait and see what Marvel comes up with in Avengers, the maybe King Dynasty, and Avengers Secret Wars. And I think that yes, Loki must always sit there and never ever ever poop. I'm Christo Siegel on Twitter asks, how did they take centuries to explain physics to Loki when the loom was going to explode? Wouldn't it have just exploded minutes/hours after the interaction in the repairs department? So that's a great question. Loki would have time slipped to the distant past and met a past version of OB who taught him everything that he needed to know. Actually, maybe he didn't learn from OB because then OB would have remembered him when they first met. Instead, he could have gone to any number of planets or time periods and studied physics with the greatest minds in the universe.
Yeah, like Bill Murray learning piano on Groundhog Day.
Exactly, high five. Noob Scrub Bot asks, if the loom over Lodi was inevitable and just going to reset everything anyways, then there was never a sequence of events where Timely could have become He Who Remains. So, what was the purpose of He Who Remains leaving instructions to give Timely the manual? Great question. First of all, we don't know for sure that Victor Timely is He Who Remains. We, ScreenCrush, just assumed that after episode 3. I think that originally, He Who Remains used Victor Timely to build or rebuild the TVA, and that is when Timely worked with OB on the TVA's designs. But remember what he really wanted this season? He wanted to be free.
I'm a peacock, Captain! You gotta let me fly on this one!
I mean, this was Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
My name is Willy Wonka.
He needed someone to take over who he could trust to not seek power for himself. Somebody who only wanted to keep the Kang variants at bay. He even says that Loki meeting Victor was part of the plan.
How is Victor Timely?
So, He Who Remains' new plan was for Victor Timely to instead arrive at the TVA before it ended. This allowed OB to improve his temporal loom. It placed Loki in a situation where he could almost win. This situation then forced Loki to travel back in time, over and over, failing and failing again.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
Until he realized his only way forward was to take the place of He Who Remains.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
Flynn Jitsu asks, if the type of time travel Loki was doing was the kind where he transfers his mind to his past/future selves, how was he able to see himself a few times when he was time traveling? Was he doing different types of time travel? Great question.
Great job!
So we actually see Loki do two different kinds of time travel. In one type of time travel, he's moving his body around, and the other, he's moving his mind around. Now, when he's moving his body around accidentally, this is like the closed loop time travel. It's why he prunes himself at the end of episode 4. Basically, in that kind of time travel, events that are supposed to happen will happen because they've already happened.
Got it. Get it. Got it. Good.
But when he learns to control the time slipping, this is retrocausality, like we talked about earlier. It's like Back to the Future, when he can travel into the past and affect the future of the TVA. So what he did in the finale is becoming unstuck in time, like Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-5. He is able to travel into his past mind and change his own time stream, again, like Back to the Future.
Whoa, this is heavy.
But then wouldn't he erase his own past?
No, because Loki is now at the center of time, which makes him essentially the audience. And just as we view the events of the show in a linear way that makes Loki who he is in the finale, Loki has also experienced time in that way. Basically, if we saw it happen to Loki in the show, then it always happened to Loki in this universe, and that cannot be erased. So all the time travel made the story confusing, so let's answer some questions about the plot. Denza asks, my only issue is after hearing they changed the 5th episode, it makes sense with the no conclusion for Renslayer and Miss Minutes. It just seemed odd the story went nowhere for those two characters.
Wait, they nuked episode 5?
Apparently, in an interview with Script Magazine, showrunner Eric Martin said that the studios nuked the episode because it wasn't something they were into. Now, he later conceded that they were right, and he said that it would have been one of the stranger things that the MCU had ever done. It was a big swing. Now look, we may never find out what was going to happen in that episode, but it does seem like that if Marvel was trying to remove Kang and replace him with Dr. Doom, then they could have ordered the writers to create an ending where Loki takes over the multiverse and Kang becomes a footnote in Mobius's filing cabinet.
I guess one of them caused a little bit of a ruckus on 616 Adjacent Realm, but they handled it.
Now to answer your question about Miss Minutes and Ravonna, it was open-ended. If they dump Kang, then she was eaten by Elias, but if they keep going with the multiverse saga the way she is, like potentially Kang could show up and save her.
Yeah, and when the multiversal war starts, she'll be there. And wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
All right, Kyle2464 says, how did Brad change the sacred timeline without branching? Was he meant to become an actor? Yeah, I think you nailed it. He found out that he was an actor on the sacred timeline, so he killed his other self and took his place so he could become rich and famous and date movie stars. And that way, he could also hide from the TVA. They couldn't find him in the sacred timeline because he was just living out the normal life that he was supposed to have.
I don't want to be rich. Someone important, like an actor.
Callan Hassel asks, did Renslayer and Miss Minutes not know about the basement, OB, and the loom's location? Why, when Brad grabbed Timely, did they take him to the war room to question him about where his prototype was? Shouldn't they have assumed that it was with OB and Mobius in the RNA? That made no sense to me. Why are you assuming that they knew he was in the RNA with OB? All they knew was that Mobius and Loki said the TVA was in danger and they grabbed Timely. They had no way of knowing he had contact with OB or left his gear in RNA. Heather Feather 7199 asks, what happens to Brad after he pruned Renslayer and was no longer possessed by Sylvie. They just left him in the judges' chambers. Was he just roaming the TVA halls afterwards until the time loom exploded? What the hell happened to him? Yeah, I also thought they kind of dropped the ball on this one, and his fate might have been explained in the original draft of episode 5 that we mentioned earlier. Like, Brad's function was to sit at the center of this moral battle for the soul of the TVA, but that battle was done, like, within one episode. Like, I wish that his death had mattered more, or been on screen, or had any effect on the story whatsoever. Sarka11594 asks, I also find it weird that Sylvie never mentioned she had a Thor, or an Odin, or Heimdall, etc. The other Loki variants in season 1 mentioned their Thors, with Prince Loki having killed his Thor for his Nexus event. They really underutilized a lot of characters for the sake of brevity, and it was a mistake. No, I think it would have been a mistake to linger on the Loki-Thor relationship in this show. We have seen that play out before in the movies, and this is not Thor's story, it is Loki's story. Sylvie had no hang-ups about Odin and Thor because, as a child, she decided to become a hero, a Valkyrie, as she was playing with their toys. And she even says that they told her she was adopted at a young age.
No, I knew I was adopted.
What? They told you?
Yeah.
I guess the difference is, in Sylvie's universe, maybe because she was a girl instead of a boy, Odin and Frigga were like much better parents to her. Ajini RC has a question that we answered last season. I have a question related to season 1. When Odin adopted him, he put magic on Loki to make him look like a normal guy in Asgard, even though he was a frost giant. So why does Loki look like a human in the TVA? With this, we only ever see Loki turn into a frost giant once, when he's holding the Cask of Winters, the ancestral power of his people. And this show clearly states that there is a dampener that prevents magic in the TVA.
Magic powers. They're no good in the TVA, Mr. Laufeyson.
Now, there is a solution to this already established in the MCU. Remember when Strange told Ebony Maw,
"You find removing a dead man's spell troublesome."
This establishes that spells linger on after they have been cast. Think about how Agatha is still trapped in her body after Wanda casts her spell. But I think the dampeners in the TVA mean that nobody can use any new magic spells. But if you already had a magic spell cast on you, nothing you can do about it, it continues on. Force410 has a great question. How does his magic/god powers explain what he was able to do in the finale, giving life to all the timelines? Also, if he could withstand temporal radiation, why didn't he just go out to try the initial method in the first place? So, at the end, Loki actually enchants all the timelines. We see that with his green energy. The same ability that we saw him use in conjunction with Sylvie, but on Eliath. And what is an enchantment? It's showing someone a lie and then making it true. An enchantment is a story. And in the comics, this is why Loki becomes the god of stories. And that is how he gives life to the timelines, by rewriting their stories. As for why he didn't go out there himself earlier, he's Loki. He's a self-serving a-hole who had to learn humility over centuries and centuries and centuries. RV made a good point here. They asked why, after the magic security protocols were lifted, why didn't Loki just grab the Infinity Stones and use those? Well, for one thing, I don't think the Infinity Stones don't work in the TVA because of the magic dampeners. I think they don't work because the TVA exists outside of every universe, and the stones are all tied to their universes. We heard this from the Ancient One.
The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time.
And in the show, we see that the Infinity Stones aren't even as powerful in alternate universes as they are in their home dimensions.
Thus, the Infinity Stones are unique.
So the stones will work on the timelines, just not outside of them, like in the TVA. Sapphire5071 says the kid at the World's Fair talks about the ghost clock haunting the Midway, and there was a drawing in the paper, but that event with Victor Timely and Renslayer hadn't yet happened. That's because Miss Minutes had already been haunting the World's Fair for a few days before Mobius and Loki arrived. Hector Wilson P. asks, Victor Timely was a variant of Kang. If the new TVA is in charge of hunting and pruning Kang variants, then what happened to Victor Timely, who risked his life to save the TVA? First of all, the TVA is not hunting down the variants of He Who Remains. It's more like they are policing all of these Kangs and making sure that they don't threaten the multiverse. But what's interesting is, this doesn't seem like it was the original intention of the show. He Who Remains says that his variants are running wild.
My variants are already out there.
And then we have the ending of Quantumania, which seems like it was like setting up a whole army of Kangs coming after the 616 Avengers.
They're beginning to touch the multiverse.
And now, like, the TVA just has Kangs handled.
I got those reports on the variants of He Who Remains.
And as for Victor Timely, look, he just lives and dies as a poor candle maker. Loki probably saw that he would become far too dangerous if he were ever pulled out of his timeline. I mean, after all, we do see him display some pretty Kang-like traits, like not sharing power. Peter T. asks, who was the 8-year-old boy that eventually killed 5,000 people? It doesn't matter, the kid was pruned, so this isn't somebody we would have ever heard of in our timeline because he was supposed to be pruned. Kelvington asks, was the reason the new TVA manuals were blank because they were meant to be journals and no longer manuals? I'll be honest, I totally missed the pages were blank. In fact, I still kind of think this is a mistake on the filmmaker's part. But If you want a no prize, let's say that they don't need the manuals anymore because with Loki in charge, they no longer need the temporal loom. Uncle D asks, maybe I'm overthinking it, but why was Loki able to time slip and not Sylvie? Should they not be able to time slip because they are both gods and both used He Who Remains temp pad? You're not overthinking it. That is a valid question. The reason Loki is time slipping like that is because He Who Remains would have pre-programmed his temp pad, so when Sylvie used it on Loki, it would scatter Loki's temporal aura across the time stream and eventually give him the ability to time slip.
Why did he do that?
Because, like I keep saying, He Who Remains wanted Loki to take his place, and to do that, Loki had to learn to time slip and become a master of time. Brandon Ficara asked, this might not be a plot hole, but how did Loki know he wouldn't get spaghettified when he went out onto the bridge with no protection? Seemed cavalier with how much time he spent trying to defeat Kang. That's kind of the point. He didn't know he would be safe. He had to take a leap of faith and actually risk his own life for his friends. Now, we never actually see Loki ever do that before. Even in Infinity War, when he stood up to Thanos, like his plan was to knife him. This is the first time I think we've ever seen him truly put his life on the line. In fact, I think him standing up to the radiation is also a great counterpoint to Thor forging Stormbreaker or Nidavellir. David Nurl asks, how will Mobius live on his home timeline with the variant living there with his boys? He won't live there. That's the point. It's bittersweet that he sees how good his life was before he was taken by the TVA. Now, though, he is free to pursue a new life on any timeline, but a piece of him will always long for that time with his kids. Rohit Gower says, in the last episode, Loki was gathering all his friends to match the temporal aura at the time before the explosion of the temporal loom, but he was still making a mistake by not including Victor Timely, since he was also present there at that time. You are not wrong, but was Timely actually returned to his own timeline? Was his timeline already pruned? Maybe Loki tried to find that timeline. Honestly, look, they flew through that whole sequence so fast, even ignoring that Loki was in New York in 2012 and never heard about the Battle of New York, like it was never mentioned. Like, I think that, that's the episode that they rewrote in a single weekend, so like, who knows? And finally, we had a lot of questions about how this show fits into the complicated tapestry of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Dada Axel asks, isn't Loki technically just holding our universe together, since, as shown in What If, the universe can be split into multiple timelines but collectively form one universe? Dada, this is going back to a whole thing. What's the difference between a universe and a timeline? Sometimes it seems like the sacred timeline is one universe stacked along with others. Sometimes it's a bunch of universes bound together. Here's what we know. In What If, the Watcher says,
that's the moment that created a new universe.
So for me, like, that settles it. Branching timelines are considered new universes. Each branching universe is part of the multiverse, and dimensions like the quantum realm and the freaky dimensions we saw in Doctor Strange 1 are like adjacent to each individual universe. Along these same lines, Pirate Ghost asks, I'm still a bit confused. We've seen the multiverse visually in two different ways, the strands of time like the sacred timeline and as black holes. Are these the same things, or does each black hole consist of a different sacred timeline? And what is colliding to make an incursion? So I believe you're referring to the opening of Loki episode 6 when we run through historical events, pull out of a black hole, and then enter another black hole that takes us into the sacred timeline. Now, I always took this to mean that each black hole is one timeline, one universe that are each contained within the sacred timeline.
Oh yeah, like the end of Men in Black?
Yes, like the end of Men in Black. Dash Bennett says the events of Quantumania happen in the 616 adjacent realm. Does that mean that every universe has its own quantum realm? Are there an infinite number of quantum realms that exist between universes? And if so, are there infinite Kangs that were banished there? Could a variant defeat Ant-Man? I think you're overthinking this. Yes, the quantum realm is adjacent to 616, but there are probably other quantum realms out in the multiverse. It is possible that other Kangs were also banished to other universes' quantum realms, but like an infinite number of universes does not mean that the same exact event happened in infinite number of times. When the probability is infinite, it means that everything happened at least once. And finally, Chris Para asks, if the TVA prunes all the different timelines except the sacred timeline, why do in Spider-Man No Way Home we see variants of other universes? Because Spider-Man No Way Home happens after He Who Remains is killed and the timelines branch out of control. And hey, just a reminder everybody to get a free holiday starter pack and a delicious, convenient coffee from Cometeer. Click our link in the description. So, do you have any questions or comments about Loki? Let us know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.